This short video is on Shakespeare's world, an understanding of what was it like to be in Shakespeare's world. In Shakespeare's theatre, you'd have a number of people coming to watch the play. And so these people would be made up of lots of different types of people. It wasn't all the same type of people that went in there. So you'd have the poor and you'd have the rich. Now they'd be sitting in different places. You'd have the poor, usually at the groundlings, in the pit or the yard, and you'd have the rich in the galleries. So you had a wide spread of people. And that wide spread of people was actually included in Shakespeare's plays because you would have rich and poor characters in the story. Because what the story would do is it would try to appeal to all levels of people. So you'd have servants or people with jobs, workers. And so you might have, for example, in Romeo and Juliet, you have a nurse and some servants in the story. And so people in the pit and the yard, the groundlings, would be able to identify with them. But then also in stories, you'd have people that would be rich. And so you might have kings, queens, but also might have people who are head of a household or people who are businessmen. And so you'd have a wide spread of people. So you'd have stories related to the poor and you'd have stories within a play related to the rich. But also there would be stories that related to everybody. So that might be relationships between fathers and daughters, mothers and daughters, about children. Everybody's been a child, so you'd have stories that feature children growing up, which everybody can identify with. Or you might have something to do with marriage, falling in love, or connections between people and relationships, or the loss of somebody, the death. And so you could see that Shakespeare's plays worked on a number of levels, and they appealed to both the rich and poor, but also that Shakespeare talked about universal ideas, universal things that most people would be able to understand and would be interested when watching the play. So the poor generally tend to be workers, and they were known as the groundlings, and they stood in the yard watching the play, standing up, and they would have paid a penny for that option. Now, what we tended to see in Shakespeare's plays is that the poor characters tend to be quite comical, and they make mistakes because they've not been to school, not been educated, but often they had common sense, and they actually understand a lot more about the world than possibly the rich people did because they were in it. And you tend to see that the poor characters tend to be for physical comedy, so they'd be things like falling over or slapstick. And they tend to be making fun of the rich characters. But the poor audience would tend to sort of identify with them, and often some of the audience who were rich as well would identify with them because they were very comical and very down-to-earth characters. We look at the rich characters, and as I said, we tend to see them in plays because there would be kings and queens, or there'd be people with a high status in society. And they would be the nobility, so the people that had got where they were in life because of their family, or they'd be business owners that had been successful. And they would pay a couple of pennies and they would sit in the galleries, but also they'd probably pay for an extra to sit on a lovely cushion, and they would have paid the money for it. And in Shakespeare's plays, we see them in positions of power, so they are usually in charge. And for them, their stories tend to be about responsibility and duty. And so we're seeing about how they cope with having power, how easy it is to be a king or queen, and often it isn't. Or we see them trying to control people. So you might see, a business owner trying to control his servants. But then there's a focus on money and property. And so you'd see that these people would be about how they look after their money and their property. But the humour would be very different. So whereas the poor would be comical, slapstick, funny humour, the humour that's associated with the rich tends to be more intelligent humour. So there'd be puns and funny little subtle jokes. In Shakespeare's time, women were not allowed to act. in plays. So all Shakespeare's plays, all the female characters were played by young boys. And it was against the law for a woman to act on stage. The world was very different for the Elizabethans, and for women, there were three roles for them in society. They were either mothers, wives, or daughters, and their roles were generally related to men and their relationship with men. And so the husband would be responsible for looking after the woman, or a father would be responsible for looking after his daughter. And for women, they couldn't own property, they couldn't have houses, and so they were reliant on men. Women would work if they were in poor families, but generally, if you had money, it would be an expectation that the woman wouldn't work. Marriage wasn't seen in the ways which we look at marriage nowadays in terms of love. Marriage is often seen as a transaction, and marriages were organized so that men could profit. And that might mean to improve status, or that they would get money from the father, which we'd call a dowry. And so by marrying a daughter, you could be paid by the father to marry them. And so you would actually benefit from marrying somebody's daughter. Because that's the difficulty. If a daughter didn't marry, then the father was stuck with that daughter. So it was to his benefit that he married off his daughter and paid somebody to take the daughter off. And so you can see in Elizabethan times that women were quite trapped in the society that we had then. Okay, now that you've watched that video, quick little knowledge check, see if you can answer these questions based on this video.